Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Louise, Curator of Natural History for the High Desert Museum. Thank you for attending tonight's Natural History Pub, and thanks as always to our loyal museum members for helping to make this event possible. We would also like to thank our programme sponsors, Fairfield Inn and Suites, and also the National Endowment for the Humanities. At the bottom of the Zoom window, you should see a chat function. We welcome you to submit questions for Jakob throughout this evening's talk. And at the end of his presentation, we'll be able to select a few questions from the chat. The topic of tonight's presentation complements our new exhibition, Damn It, Beavers and Us, which we hope to be able to open to visitors very soon, along with all of our other indoor exhibitions. The museum website, www.highdesertmuseum.org, is the best place to go to find latest updates on that. And without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening. Jakob Shockey is co-founder, executive director, and board president of the Beaver Coalition. Jakob lives with his wife and their 3 children in southwestern Oregon, along the same creek he grew up swimming in. As a teenager, he gentled a feral horse from public land. He named him Hank and hauled him off to college, where he trimmed horse hooves and braided reins for textbook money. As a wildlife biologist and restoration practitioner, he has been working professionally in Oregon's streams, rivers, and wetlands for over 7 years. He is the foremost authority in mitigating beaver conflicts in Oregon through his company, Beaver State Wildlife Solutions. Jakob has published research on the endangered pygmy three-toed sloth of Panama and worked for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Applegate Partnership. Jakob is a writer, hunter, paragliding pilot, and fiddler. Welcome, Jakob, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. And here, I'll share my screen. I'm excited to share with you all what I've done with Beaver, and look forward to a good question and answer. Here we go. All right, collaborating or coexistence with Beaver for a resilient future. So as an overview of my talk today, I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk about this term, keystone role, and how beavers serve that role in ecosystems. From there, we're going to move into the historical context of beaver and beaver in North America. And then we'll get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty around when beaver and their ideas around landscaping conflict with ours, and some of the strategies we can use to outsmart them or work with them. And we'll wrap up with a little bit of an idea of a strategic path forward for beaver and us in the landscape. So an introduction, like Louise said, I am now raising my children on the same property that I grew up on. I was the skeptical child watching my parents plant trees, and I've now realized I'm in that role myself. I cut my teeth as a restoration practitioner in this alphabet soup of logos. This is sort of the world that, you know, if you're trying to better habitat, you find yourself in. There's nonprofit organizations doing the work. There's agencies supporting the work and directing the work to some extent. There's funders that are looking to use their money well. And then there's private contractors that are usually working with the nonprofits to actually implement some of the ideas that are being planned. And as a restoration practitioner, I did a lot of the typical stuff. We installed root wads in streams for fish habitat. We took out these old concrete barriers that dot our landscape and have been largely abandoned by past water users. We took out big mono crops of invasive species and tried to plant more diverse plant communities. In my area, it's blackberry, and what we were really trying to do is some action that led to habitat. And there's a lot of people's energy that's put into this. There's a lot of money, and it's not working a lot of the time. And if we start thinking about it's not working, it comes down to sort of a simple idea around rather than building what we see as good habitat, kind of creating a project to build this static idea of what we see as good habitat. Where there's this sort of broad movement in the restoration world to realizing, well, we need to actually be doing something that facilitates the natural process that leads to habitat. Habitat, I like to think of it as like, habitat's like an indicator of the health of an ecosystem, like perhaps your body's health is an indicator of the health of your habits, right? So in a sense, we're trying to change the habits, and that will lead to better health. And we can't just, give the environment steroids and expect it to look good forever. So that led to my focus on beaver as that thing that we can do to tip a floundering habitat, aquatic system into better health. And beaver can really be that cascade that then leads into the water, the habitat, the fish, all the things that we find value in. This is a wetland near where I live, and it was a cattle pasture. The creek had been moved over to the side and diked, as many creeks were in this area. And the landowner sold to a couple absentee landowners who weren't in the area and let it go back to wildlife. And the beaver quickly flooded this 7-acre cattle pasture and turned it back into a functional wetland. I couldn't build this if you gave me $1 million of restoration money, right? And yet beavers did it for free. And so this was really what drove me to focus on beaver. If we kind of move into, okay, let's understand the animal a little bit before we start talking about how beaver and human interface. They build a number of things on the landscape. Here's the lodge from that same wetland in the larger photo. You can see it's sort of a freestanding structure surrounded by water. There's another lodge, one I found in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho, where they've more or less built a lodge but up on a bank. And beaver will either den in banks or they'll den in lodges. And the objective is to get into a place where they're dry, right? They can't breathe water. They need an air pocket, but they also want to be protected from predation. So their entrance is underwater always. So often when you have a fully reconnected floodplain, when there really is no high bank, that's when you'll see them building their own structure to get up out of the water. But in a lot of systems, we have high banks, and so that's why lodges are relatively rare in this current context. The other structure they build are dams. Beaver don't live in the dam. These are a structure made out of mud and sticks and whatever else. And it's primarily to back up water throughout the beaver's habitat. So beaver are damming to, again, avoid predation and also access more habitat. They're sort of a self-perpetuating cycle, and that as they build these dams, more water moves out across the floodplain, more willow grow, they can access more, and they will have often a primary dam that's backing up water to their entrance. So here you can see I'm standing on the bank and I'm looking down at a beaver entrance. I'm more or less on top of the lodge, and you can see just downstream is the primary dam, and the small photo shows it from looking upstream at it. So you'll have a primary dam that's really their front door. If that dam falls apart, they're suddenly exposed to air through their tunnel and anything that might choose to come in. And so they care a lot about that dam. And when we start talking about how to work with beaver in the landscape, it's usually important to try to determine if you're working with a primary dam or a secondary dam. The secondary dams are those that they build out across the landscape to access more habitat. And so sometimes, depending on your stream, you may have a whole number of secondary dams reaching out across the landscape. So the small picture here is what it looks like if you stick your head in the water, and the big picture is what it looks like if you then stick your shoulders and head through the tunnel and try to get into the beaver den itself. So this is a beaver den I managed to squirrel up into, and luckily nobody was home. You can see it's a pretty cozy little spot lined in some willows and in the sand, and probably 4 feet round. So this is a typical bank den. They're not like nutria where they will dig extensive condominiums. Usually it's kind of one main chamber, maybe two connected, and then sometimes there's an emergency exit or an air vent, etc. And for beaver, really, the actions that we see them taking often come down to avoiding getting eaten. So they're sometimes 60 pounds of slow-moving protein if they don't have water. And they're really easy to catch on land, and a really good catch if you're a predator. So a lot of what they're doing is for safety. And in our area, historically, wolves would have been a big predator for beaver. Now it's primarily coyote and, well, actually, probably not coyote, cougar, and human. Okay, Beaver Sign. So small photo, we've all seen this little stump. This one was actually an image in Germany. I jumped out and trespassed on some farmer's land to get it because I was excited that Eurasian beaver was almost extinct, and it's slowly starting to make its way back through Europe. And this other photo is down in West Lynn, or up in West Lynn and Portland. And you can see beaver are creatures of habit. They often follow the same path out to go forage and back. And eventually they will actually invest in those paths and dig them down into canals. So this one you can see in the foreground where the stem is sort of blocking the view of the path. The beaver have actually started digging this down, and it was probably 16 inches deep there all the way out to the creek. And so not only do they build their lodges and their dens and their dams, but this is another thing that they spend a lot of time doing. Beavers spend a lot of time moving soil around in their habitat. Beaver sticks, I'm sure many of you have seen these. Beaver, contrary to Narnia, having portrayed them as eating fish, they are in fact vegans, and they primarily cambion off of woody species during the winter, and so we often see a lot of beaver sticks in the winter, them felling trees, and then in the spring or summer, often they'll focus on more herbaceous plants. They'll eat aquatic vegetation too, and so sometimes people don't notice that they have beaver in their neighborhood until we get into that wintertime season again, and you start seeing the woody species. And let's see, where am I going from here? Yeah, that's basically an overview of the animal itself. So if we take that and we say, okay, we've got a very big rodent, a little mammal. They're primarily creating this habitat for their own needs, but they've been doing so for 27 million years. And they've been doing so in a very predictable manner. So when you've got that, you've got this term keystone species, some animal that's driving a process predictably over time. And then all the other animals need to get used to that, right? And they co-evolve to that habitat that's being created. And so in the Northern Hemisphere, anything that has to do with water and wetlands and creeks co-evolved with beaver, and they co-evolved with a landscape necklace with beaver ponds. This is a good slide. I think it was originally from perhaps Ducks Unlimited. Some of the early organizations to try to work on beaver reintroduction were actually sportsmen groups. So Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and Trout Unlimited were all looking at relocating beaver for the benefits that they provide to hunted species. So, and in as beaver create these ecosystems, you can start pointing your finger at various things and often notice an increase, and then the rest of the native wildlife that specialize on that habitat. Across much of the arid landscape, we've got creeks that look like this. They get further and further down into a ditch. And for a long time, we congratulated ourselves with that because, you know, they stayed in their banks, and you know, that troublesome floodwater moved out to the ocean faster. But when you get that, you also get drying riparian areas, you get drying floodplains, and you get a drop in water table. And you can see here, there's a beaver dam recently built in this incised stream, and that blush of new red willow growth responding to just the little bit of increase in water table as the water starts tracking back up with the beaver dam. Here's a great example of as the beaver dams get more established, you start seeing that green line expanding, right? And there's a lot of focus now in the arid West, often led by the ranching community specifically, on bringing beaver back into these arid landscapes and working lands for what they do for the water table and water security. You're slowing down and you're sequestering water during this time of year, and then seeing later season flows throughout the year. You've got basically a rodent that's obsessed with retaining water on the landscape, otherwise they die, right? So what better ally when we're looking at retaining water on the landscape on scale? So there's been a lot of interest in that recently. And in some streams where the incision is too deep, the stream is too fast for beaver to make a stand. They put up a dam and it fails pretty soon thereafter in the winter floods. And so beaver dam analogues, originally pioneered very close to Bend and Bridge Creek, have now become more or less famous in the restoration community across North America. And this is our attempt at slowing that velocity barrier enough to where beaver can come in and take over. So we're playing at beaver. We're building, you know, our shoddy impressions of the beaver dam in hopes that at some point we address enough of that velocity that's limiting beaver from being on the site, and we can get beaver back. And in the meantime, we can see some of the benefits that beaver dams would be providing. So this photo, the bottom is a beaver. The upper animal is a muskrat. And this book, 3 Against the Wilderness, is probably the first instance of beaver dam analogues being discussed that I know of. It's a trapping family, and they're in the Canadian outback, late 1800s, early 1900s, I don't remember exactly. And they moved to a valley that had been trapped out and then had a catastrophic wildfire. And so the habitat was severely degraded, and yet they needed to make money trapping. And so they recognized that where beaver wetlands were healthy, there were lots of muskrat. And where there were lots of muskrat, there were lots of coyote. And coyote was really the fur that they were after. And so doggedly for years on end, they built and maintained beaver dams out across this landscape. Eventually they were able to persuade the Canadian government to give them a few beaver, and they got beaver in and doing the work. And it's a lovely story early on of a practical partnership with beaver, and no less from the point of view of increasing fur trapping. So if you look at some of the early journals of folks that were moving out across this landscape, many of the streams look like this. You'll see these necklaces of beaver ponds, and these beaver ponds were so established that they were landscape features enough to be mapped. Some of these beaver dams, you would read accounts of being able to drive a full team of horses across because it was so permanent in the landscape. And that these areas were in constant flux, but very complex, very threaded. And of course, before gold drove white folk into this region, it was beaver pelts. So the first real natural resource that was exploited in the West were beaver, and it was because this silly looking hat was in style at the time. And beaver felt is really, really good at keeping water out and warmth in, of course. And so beaver fur was worth a lot. These tokens here, the Hudson Bay Company, it was perhaps the first standard-based currency. You could trade 5 made beaver, that's what MB stands for. Made beaver would be a fleshed out, salted, dried beaver skin and get one of these company tokens with which you could buy anything at the general store, right? Or trade amongst yourselves. So they really were, before there was a gold standard in the West, it was the beaver standard. And they really did support the entire economy. This fellow, Peter Skin-Ogden, was the first white fellow through my area, and I believe Bend as well. I'm down in Applegate in southwestern Oregon. And he wrote in his journal, upon encountering a war between the tribes near present-day Klamath Falls, they may destroy each other, the more the better. If they are fond of war, let them enjoy it, and we, in the meantime, will endeavor to wage war on their beaver. He had recently killed a couple indigenous folks up in the Seattle area, and he was looking to skip trial, and he was a Hudson Bay Company man, and so they helped him out and sent him on the Snake River expeditions. His task was to create a fur desert through the coast all the way to the Snake River, such that when the American trappers were coming up the coast from the California area, they would reach this area where there was not a single fur bearer, and they would think, well, there's nothing for us here, and they would turn around and go home. So this was, in a sense, a wall, a border wall that this man was tasked with creating by wiping out every fur bearer in our region. In Europe, they didn't fare much better. So the glands of beaver accumulate salicylic acid from willow, which is very much like aspirin in its properties. And so the beaver glands themselves were worth a lot as a medicinal. They were worth a year's wages as a medieval laborer for 1 gland. And beaver have 2. And then the body of that beaver itself was worth a 3rd year's wages. So you were looking at 3 years' wage incentive to kill any beaver you could possibly find. The meat of beaver was worth so much because the Catholic Church decreed that since they are in the water and they have scales on their tail, they must be a fish. And as a fish, you were able to eat them during those Catholic holidays when otherwise red meat is not allowed. And so anyone who's looking for a red meat meal when they shouldn't have been allowed to have one paid dearly for beaver meat during that period. And here you can see that the bales of fur moving through the Pacific Northwest. These were really a massive natural resource to be extracted. And for a long time, that's how they were seen. Then for the last probably 100 years, they've been seen as a pest, a nuisance species on the landscape that you have to deal with. And I guess the change that we're seeing again is back to that idea of them being a natural resource. This time less to be extracted and more to be encouraged and partnered with and facilitated across the landscape. So with that, let's move into conflicts with beaver, because this is how most beaver end up dying. They have a tendency of chewing down trees that we care about. And when they don't chew down trees that we care about, sometimes they flood trees we care about. Trees don't like wet roots. If we talk about the trees that are native to this area, well, they co-evolved with beaver. Those trees that are wetland trees in our area know about beaver, and they sprout back really quickly to beaver coppicing. And often that's less of a concern. It may be aesthetically unpleasing for us, but often a bunchier, more complex tree is better habitat in and itself too. And some of these, like some species of willow, really do need that renewal. But other trees don't respond well. Mostly those trees we plant. So apple trees, Japanese maple, these things that we like to plant in our yards. When beaver chew them down, they don't bounce back. And so there's a number of ways you can protect trees. Wire is very effective if you use the strong welded wire, not chicken wire. Think about it as, these animals are 60 pounds, and if they put their front legs up, they're gonna squash down anything that's not sufficiently rigid. You wanna go at least 30 inches high, and then think about if you get snow, you wanna be higher, right? because then beaver will be moving in on top of the snow line. And most importantly, you want to leave room for trees to grow. I've seen a lot of trees that were protected for their own good, only to be forgotten and later die at the hand of the wire girdling them. And you can see in this photo too, these folks protected the root collar. That's another good idea, because otherwise beaver may just girdle your tree at its roots, and you know, it'll die anyway. Here's a couple trees where the wire was less successful. The second photo there, they used 4x4 field fencing. As you can see, the beaver just went around the tree and chewed a 4x4 hole out everywhere they could access the trunk. And then the other photo here is where they had really tight protection with chicken wire, and I assume the beaver squashed the chicken wire down because it was all around the base of this tree, wadded up. And they tried to chew the tree down, but you can see the tree, meanwhile, had grown into that metal, that steel T-post. And so now there's this, like, it's a pretty big tree wobbling next to a bike path in Portland. And the beaver didn't get what they needed, and now it's a pretty hazardous tree that somebody's gonna have to deal with. So, but it's very simple if you just use welded wire and give it a little bit of room. Another option is latex paint and sand. Use clean, dry sand. Basically as much sand as you can get to stick in the paint. I use a paddle wheel to mix it up on a drill. Again, about the same height. Important thing to note here, it doesn't work with saplings. So what you're doing is you're basically creating a rubberized sandpaper. When the beaver bite into that, they don't like it grinding away their teeth, and they'll leave the tree alone. But if you have small trees where it's 1 or 2 bites and the beaver are through, well, then you're still going to lose your tree. So it really works on the bigger trees where it's more of a project. And you can match the tree's color or just buy really cheap reject paint, depending on where the tree is at and who cares. Here's a couple that I've noticed just as I've been running around the landscape where beavers are. These are various examples of things that I found folks doing, and they clearly cared less about the color. And here's an example of some folks who really spent a lot of time with the color. So the tree with the orange ribbon has been painted all the way up. And you can see they came in with black highlights and more or less made it disappear into the landscape. So it's pretty fun, and you don't have to have ugly fencing if you don't want to in protecting your trees. Another tree to protect, of course, is orchards and crops. I've walked a couple orchards where beaver have been very successful in taking out a lot of trees in short order. Luckily, in these managed working landscapes, it's pretty easy to exclude beaver from just the whole place with electrical fencing. So beaver come out of the ground, they're sopping wet, they're dragging their belly along the ground. And if you have a couple wires of electrical fencing with a little electric solar charger, it's very effective. That's sort of the levels I'd recommend, 6 and 10 inches. The big point is you have to maintain the vegetation under the wire, especially during fire season. Obviously, this could be a big deal. So that is the downside. You can of course put in a fence too, but this is much cheaper and works really well. The second type of conflicts with beaver are flooding. So beaver often like to plug culverts. They see a culvert in a road base, and that's like a hole, an otherwise well-constructed dam, and they plug it up, and that causes no end of consternation to the people charged with protecting the road. But they can also do this in the working landscape too. Here's a fescue field. I walked with some folks, and the farmer was losing about 7 acres of productivity to beaver flooding. And the fescue was dying out due to a plugged culvert. So we have a suite of flow devices. That's generally what they're called. These are ways to trick beaver. And there's 3 main types. There is the flexible pond leveler, the trapezoidal culvert fence, and the piping fence. And I'm just gonna breeze through these. The idea is really just to give you more of an idea of the toolkit that's available. So the flexible pond leveler, this one works like a drain in your bathtub, and you have a caged intake. That cage keeps the beaver from ever swimming close enough to tell that the water's leaving their pond. Beaver will obsess over a leak on their dam itself, but they won't look for a leak if you hide it 40 feet out in their pond. And if you keep them from ever swimming close enough, then they won't find it. And you can set the level of the pipe going through the dam at whatever level you'd like to control the water at. So this is really a great way to create a maximum height, a ceiling for a beaver impoundment. If we can allow it to some extent, but it just really can't get any higher than whatever height. Protecting culverts, you've got a couple strategies. If you've got a lot of water upstream of your culvert, you can build a trapezoid of fencing out from the culvert. And beaver will start damming near the culvert where they hear that trickling water sound. Beaver that seems to be a really strong cue for beaver to dam. They've done experiments where they stuck a battery-operated boom box out next to a beaver dam and played trickling water fountain sounds. And the next morning, there's half a ton of mud packed in around that boom box. And so beaver seem to really, really respond to that sound. And as they start damming where they can get close to that trapezoidal or that culvert on that fence, the fence drives them out into the still and quiet water. And at some point, there's no longer that cue, and they feel like they've done their work. And meanwhile, you have the entire front of that trapezoid still passing water. So that one works really well. And then there's sort of a child of the two where you can protect the culvert with fencing and then install a pond leveler through that. So you have kind of a tighter amount of fencing. You plan on the beaver damming on all of that, and then you can set the height upstream. So we're really we're working within the context of what we know they're trying to do, and finding some happy medium that they can remain on the landscape. Here's an example of a trapezoidal culvert fence I put in for Roseburg Forest Products recently. This is an important idea. So leaving an area for terrestrial wildlife to get up and out. Beaver won't discover this hole in a way that'll result in them plugging your culvert, because they won't move up onto dry land, come back in, and dam. So this is important, especially as you have animals moving through a culvert, river otters or beaver or raccoons or whomever, that they can get up and out. They'll swim around the fence and then make their way up onto the bank, and away they go. I'm working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife right now around some best management practices for fish passage. That's the other really important consideration as you start looking at some of these, especially if you're going to be doing anything with fencing and creeks. Here's a version of a pipe and fence. So you can see the beaver dam was taken out of the spillway. This is a little ag pond with a spillway. I think they feed it with a well, but the beaver had plugged the spillway. So we took the dam out, we installed this, and as they start to dam on that fence, the pipe will engage and start letting water out. Here's one that's working, so you can see all the beaver damming activity around the fence, and the pipe is still pouring water through. When you get a high water, the water is just going to come all over the top of that dam and move through the system like it normally would. So this is really just about controlling flow during those shoulder seasons, the base flow times. So in summary, here's a couple important things to remember around liability and permitting. Again, electric fences, be careful. Flow devices, again, we're hopefully going to have more direct guidance on fish passage, but that's an important one to remember. Also, be aware when you notch a beaver dam, you're sort of taking that natural system and you're destabilizing it. So there's one instance in Washington where an upstream landowner decided to notch a beaver dam, and then there was a high water event that night, and it blew the whole dam out and through a downstream landowner's living room. And upstream landowner who notched the dam was found liable for notching the dam and had to replace the living room carpet for downstream landowners. So these are things to be entered in carefully. It's sometimes not best to go in and just start notching. And then lethal removal is still currently allowed. But I think, especially as we start seeing more species listings that are pointing to beaver as one of the significant contributors for recovery, it really would serve us all well to keep working on these coexistence solutions and get them into a place where we can use them everywhere. So I'd like to save time for questions, so I'm going to move through this rather quickly, but in summary, if you have an understanding of the beaver behavior, then you have a toolkit of flow devices, you're now in a really great position to create management plans and to really think about adaptively managing beaver on a site. Those two pieces, understanding what they're going to do and why they're doing it, and then the tools that are at our disposal. I have, I don't want to say I have yet to see, but I can't remember a site where we haven't been able to coexist with beaver and come to some solution. Here's a quick example. So Fanno Park, this is actually one I haven't been involved in, but I walked it with some folks and I like to bring it up as an example. So this is near Portland, and they of course have beaver on the site. The day that I walked with the folks there, here's a number of beaver dams we found. You can see it's sort of suburbia world on one side and big box shopping world on the other side. There's this little strip of Fanno Creek in between. So if we zoom into this one, you can see the beaver dam, and it's clearly backing up water over the path. And you can see the desire path or whatever, where people have been trying to get around. And this is a perfect example of, there's some allowance for beaver on the site, but it would be better if they weren't flooding the path. So you can put a flow device in and just target reducing that impoundment to a level where the path dries out, right? So as you drop the beaver dam and install that upper cap, you're going to of course drop the size of the impoundment down with it. Some things to remember when you're doing predictive management. Think through which trees actually need protection. Don't go protecting every tree. Who doesn't coppice, which trees are special, etc. And make sure you leave enough forage for the beaver. It's important to kind of realize that by excluding trees, we're kind of destabilizing the situation at some point. And you're either going to push the beaver onto your neighbor property, or you're going to push them up further into the landscape. They may feel the need to build a bigger dam so they can get safely out onto more landscape. So it's really one of those things. Let's not get greedy. Let's think about which trees we can afford to let the beavers eat and which trees are important. There's a couple urban parks that have been doing great stuff recently with planting beaver food banks or beaver buffers, where they have these dedicated areas of really preferred beaver food, where they'll plant just thousands of red osier dogwood and willow, etc. And it not only provides a really sweet spot for the public to come watch beaver forage, but also gives a sustainable food source in the context of the park, so there's not that pressure to go up and cut a big red oak down or whatever. And then thinking through, do we care what the tree protection looks like? And remember, trees can also drown too. So this one often surprises people. They'll protect a tree and then it'll be sitting in standing water, and they won't think through that tree's not going to live if something's not done too. With dams, looking for that home dam versus an auxiliary dam. Where's their den entrance? And if you can find their den entrance and you can find the water level, well, the top of their den entrance and the water level, that freeboard, if you will, that's the room you get to play with before really destabilizing the situation. If you drop the water below that, then the beaver are going to start panicking. You've just propped open their front door, right? So finding that's really informative, because you'll know, like, oh, we have 24 inches to work with, or oh, we only have 2. And thinking through the impoundment depths and footprints that we can tolerate. Remember, if you drop it too much, chances are you're going to drive the beaver to just build another dam somewhere else. So it's this balancing act of trying to find, okay, what can we be okay with, and where are the hard lines in the landscape where we can't have the flooding above a certain level. And sometimes you can suggest a better dam location. So sometimes I've done this a couple times in sort of the Hillsborough area, where you have a lot of drain tiles and fields. These drain, it's kind of the opposite problem that a lot of the arid Oregon landscape has where we were trying to retain water. They're trying to drive water off of fields. And so they've got these tiles, they're tubes of, that are facilitating water moving out into the streams. And sometimes beaver will dam just downstream of that and back up water, and it of course backs up into that network. And if you go in quickly and take out an entire beaver dam in that day and then build your shoddy impression of a beaver dam, you know, within the same general area, often you can get them to come back that night and they'll improve upon what you built instead of building back their old dam. So you can sort of, you know, tweak location, and in this case, tweak it just upstream of the drain tile versus downstream of the drain tile. It makes all the difference to the farmer, right? And as long as you're still backing up water for the beaver's entrance, they don't seem to care as much. And in closing, I'll share this picture. This is Thompson Creek. This is the creek I grew up on. This is downstream on a ranch, probably 4 miles down the creek from me. And our area hasn't seen beaver in a long time. And a couple years ago, a beaver came into the area and tried to make a stand. This creek, I grew up in the 90s swimming every summer. It was cold, deep water. I remember dragging my feet as we crossed the cattle pasture in the summertime just to be really hot, because you knew the creek was going to be so cold when you jumped in. And my kids now play with dry, crusty rocks every summer. There are no pools to swim in. That's the shift we've seen in this creek, and it's nothing special. It's all the creeks of this region. So when the beaver moved into this creek, we were all very excited, including the landowner. And as the water started to leave in the summer, this dam, these beaver were really successful in holding back water. And what we saw was the water coming in over the surface of the stream bed dried up. And for 2 or 3 weeks, this dam not only still held water, but there was still water leaving the base of the dam. So we still had surface flow downstream. We didn't have surface flow upstream. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, the surface flow downstream dried up. And then this was the only little emerald of water in the area for a long way. It was like a Serengeti watering hole. All the wildlife was coming here. The landowner was very excited. And it was probably close to another month before that dried up. And so the beaver bailed off into a local, a nearby irrigation pond and waited out the season and then left. So that was our one chance at beaver recently. But it gets at what's possible here. You know, if we had had 2 or 3 or 5 or 25 or 250 dams upstream, they were all still retaining surface flow downstream of them, you know, and if we had a bunch more dams downstream that were catching it, it's a critical mass thing. And, you know, maybe we could see water year round in the stream again. You all are very lucky in Bend. You have a local team who has done a lot of really careful work thinking through how can we help facilitate beaver and that landscape. And so they've got a couple really exciting projects, and I would encourage you, if you're at all interested, to look at BeaverWorks Oregon. Among a many number of things that they're doing, they have a really fun trail cam lending program, so you can monitor wildlife activity at your stream, and they have training on how to set those up, and you can check those out. They also have a beaver response team if you have issues with beaver in your area or you're interested in being a first responder. And then monthly river walks in the Old Mill area, and they're also working on creating habitat, like we were talking about, addressing those limiting factors so beaver can expand into more habitat. And that's it. There's my contact information. So if you're interested in learning more, we have an organization, the Beaver Coalition. It's a new little nonprofit, and you can check us out at beavercoalition.org too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And we already have a few questions coming in. Winona asks, hi, why do we see beavers in areas with few to no trees? What are they living on? Thank you, Winona.
Yeah, good question. Well, I would guess there's something green there that they're living on. And so remember, beaver will eat the woody species that we think about them eating, like trees and shrubs. But they'll also eat aquatic grasses. They'll also eat forbs growing along the bank, sedges and rushes. So it's really quite a varied, and you see that with herbivores. Often you don't see herbivores specializing in one diet in particular, because you get plants building up defensive compounds to try to get herbivores to move on, right? And so there's often with herbivores, you see them with a broad palette eating across the landscape to try to keep from building up too much of any one plant's defensive compound. In the case of beaver, they particularly love aspen and willow, and you know there's a number of plants that are near and dear to their heart. But I've seen them eating blackberries and any number of other even invasive species. So that would be my guess, and that would be also another opportunity if you've got them there to think about, well, maybe their population is limited by food, and this would be a great spot to plant willow. You can plant willow really easily by this time of year, cutting the dormant stems and just shoving them in the soft soil right along the water line. And willow do great with that. And from what I have seen and what I've read, beaver population seems really dependent on how much food is available. So in sites with really dense food availability, I've seen beaver families very close. Beaver are very tight-knit families. They seem to mate for life. They have, you know, a mom and a dad, and then they have the young of the year, which will then grow into teenagers and stick around for another year to help as the next generation come into being. So often in a colony or in a family, you've got anywhere between 4 and 8 individuals, and how much food you have on the landscape seems to determine how tightly packed together those colonies are. So in really arid areas with very little food, or in areas where ag is coming all the way to the stream and there's not a lot, you'll often see beaver colonies that are very spread out over the landscape. You know, one colony may have close to a mile that they're moving through. But in areas with really dense vegetation, I've stood on a beaver den and listened to kits mewing in it. So I knew there was a family there. And then less than 100 yards upstream, I was on top of another beaver den with kits mewing. So that's the tightest I've ever seen. But it was like an old restoration project that was totally full of plants.
Related to that, Ed asks, how far will beaver roam to find good habitat?
A long way longer than you think. Miles and miles and miles. There was one beaver who crossed the continental divide with a radio tag on her, and that surprised everybody because she had to have left a stream and headed overland in order to do so. I don't think we know a lot about how beaver disperse. Sometimes they're dispersing really close, you know, basically a stone's throw from their parents, and sometimes it seems to be really far, you know, on the order of 20, 30 miles that they've moved around before they find a spot. We also don't seem to know if they find a mate and then together find a spot, or if it's more of a find a spot then go look for a mate, you know, and that process is still a bit obscure too. But yeah, you have beaver moving a long distance. What I would say on that though is I've worked with a lot of landowners who want beaver, and there's beaver close by and they're like, why aren't they coming to my habitat? Often it's because there's some better habitat closer to those animals that's unoccupied. So remember, beaver are very territorial. And so if you have unoccupied habitat that's better than where you're trying to entice them, chances are they're going to move there first. A lot of reasons that beaver habitat is unoccupied is they're causing some problem, and humans are deciding to lethally remove them. And so you'll get these, I call them black holes on the landscape in the population. You'll get these sites where people are on this treadmill. You know, every year the beavers show up, and every year we have to take care of them. And that basically sucks beaver from the population into this one area where it's really good beaver habitat. So if you're dispersing beaver, you're going to go there first. And yet the human dynamic, you know, is creating it so that it's a sink in the population. So those are the really great spots to focus on finding and working with the folks that are having trouble to outsmart the beaver there for more of a long-term solution, because then you can turn that on its head, and now you have a family that's living there, and they're putting out dispersing beaver every year. And so you don't have a sink anymore in the population. You might actually start seeing beaver further up. You know, as wildlife biologists, we really want to see beaver up in the tributaries, and as landowners, right? I live on a stream that is supposedly really intrinsically good habitat for beaver, but we don't have any beaver because there's, you know, it's way down the list of a place you'll move. Like there's a lot, there's better places available, right? So looking at creating that carrying capacity so we start to get them up in the tributaries where they're going to actually do great work for our water tables and our fish habitat is, I think, a good strategy.
Thank you. Tamara asks, says, my understanding is flood control by beaver dams is most effective if it starts near the top of the watershed, so flow is not too high lower down. How do those of us who live at altitude contribute to that? And as a secondary question, they haven't seen much beaver sign up along Thompson Creek or its tributaries. They're wondering if they're there, and if not, how do we bring them back?
Well, the second part's easy. I would say get a hold of Beaver Works Oregon, because I know that they're compiling observations and they might be able to help you on Tumalo. But I think that's a great question after what we were just talking about with where's the best next available habitat. So there's been a lot of projects moving beaver, and I'm guilty of this too. I've taken beaver down in the valley bottoms where they're causing problems and stuck them way up in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, where you've got, in this context, we have a Oregon spotted frog population that's going extinct. It's the only one left in the region. And there's 9 female frogs left. And they're dependent on this beaver dam, and the beaver all got killed. And so the dam's been failing, the frog habitat's been disappearing. And so it's like, we need to get them up there. We need to get them up there. Mm-hmm. And the beaver I moved up there, you know, they were valley bottom beaver, and you know, they stuck it out for a little bit, and then the pond froze over, and life was getting hard, and you could watch them just move back down into the valley, you know, and so I think that is a challenge in seeing these upper reaches where we really want beaver. I mean, you're right, the lower flows are advantageous for dam building, absolutely. But if beaver are preferring these slow valley bottoms where they can just live in a bank, they don't even need to build a dam, life is easy, there's lots of food, how are we going to convince them to go up where it's colder and they have to work harder, right? And I think a lot of that is addressing these black holes in the population and really starting to naturally recruit them out. If you're really, really far away from other beaver, then you know, a potential argument could be made for moving beaver in there. But I think in your area, beaver relocation isn't actually allowed either. Even where it is allowed in Oregon, it's very hard to get permission to do it. You basically need 6 miles of landowner signatures on all sides of you saying, yes, I'm okay with you moving beaver, which is more or less impossible unless you're way out in Eastern Oregon. So it really, that focus on build it and they will come, but at the same time also addressing the black holes where they're getting removed from the landscape. I think that's the long-term strategy.
Absolutely. Jan and Jim Lee have an interesting question for you. They say, when we were kayaking at a lake in British Columbia, we came across a huge beaver dam. There were some educational signs indicating that the beavers in this area also moved rocks to help anchor the sticks where the water flow really pressured the sticks into moving too easily. They ask, have you seen this yourself?
Definitely. Yeah, most all of the dams that if there's available rocks, you know, if there's cobble on the stream bed, the beaver are using it. And, you know, sometimes these dams are 8 or 10 feet tall off the stream bed, and you'll find rocks all the way up in there. They use their front paws and they basically push the rocks up or carry them, and it's pretty fun to see. And yeah, I've found everything, especially in urban streams. Bicycles and shopping carts seem to be preferred for strengthening beaver dams too. They'll incorporate anything and everything into the dam. Often there's the perception that they won't use, like, if you tear a beaver dam out and pile it up on the bank, they'll cut new fresh trees to build a new dam. That's often what we see. But there's a number of sites now I've seen that prove that wrong too, where they'll go scoop all the material you piled up and rebuild their dam with that too. So yeah, they seem to be pretty opportunistic with what they use. And in some areas they don't have sticks and they don't have rocks. And so it's pretty incredible what they can do with fine vegetation and mud as well. I mean, that's how fiberglass works, right? It's a bunch of fibers and adhesive all together. And beaver do that really well with their dams.
Okay, I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes to get your questions in if you haven't yet had the opportunity to ask. And in the meantime, Jacob, I have one for you. You're clearly very passionate about this subject, about beavers and how they can transform habitats. I was wondering, kind of, what is your hope or your vision for the future of beavers on the landscape?
Yeah, I think, so there's a good quote, I think it's Jeff or David Thompson, now I'm not remember the man's name. There was an explorer in the 1700s that came through the West, and he wrote in his journal pretty extensively about the impacts of beaver that he saw in the landscape. And I think he wrote something like, there were two races of beings, humans and beaver. And he describes that everywhere where there was water, there was beaver dams, and even in those streams that only occasionally flowed, the beaver had built ponds and were retaining water. And I think if you look back pre-beaver trapping at what this landscape looked like, you would have had humans driving the natural process in the highlands through indigenous use of fire and, you know, other ways that we were, as humans, manipulating the habitat for our own needs. And in a sense, we were the keystone species in the drylands, and beaver were the keystone species in the water. And we were each using an element, right? We had fire and they had water, and we were creating these landscapes on which everything else then came to depend, because we were consistent enough as humans with what we did with fire, and beaver were consistent enough with what they did. And so I think if we are to see resiliency in our landscape, you know, if my kids are to swim in creeks, we need to turn it back over to the experts. And so that's really what we're working toward, is, okay, how do we as the humans work with the experts? How do we outsmart them where we've built stuff that they can't flood, you know, but how do we get ourselves out of the position of, you know, spending, I mean, the restoration industry is $1 billion industry in the Pacific Northwest, and it's not working. We're losing salmon. So, I mean, we were just talking about that in my stream. This year we had a great water year, and we should have seen coho running, and there's not been a single fish. And, you know, I remember the banks lined in dead fish as a kid. And I, you know, so, and I'm not old. I'm not like the grizzled old timer saying that story, right? So that's what we're seeing. And I think we need to just take a little humility and realize, okay, maybe we need to cede some control to the experts here, and we need to work it amongst ourselves so that we can make that happen.
That's wonderful, thank you. Ed has a question. It says, I understand that beaver teeth keep growing if they aren't used for cutting trees and shrubs. How fast do the teeth grow, and how much do they have to be used to keep them in check?
Good question. I have no idea. I do know, yes, you're right. They keep growing. And I have seen a skull where the beaver, for whatever reason, it was like the tooth was at the wrong angle. And so it grew up and actually killed the beaver. So it was like at the wrong angle, or it got too long and it wasn't shearing it off. So they're much like horses or anything else that has something that just keeps growing. And the front of their teeth are orange and actually have a pretty heavy iron component in there. They're stronger in the front than they are in the back. And so as they cut, they're self-maintaining that sharp edge, that bevel, through how durable their tooth is as you go front to back. So that's pretty cool in that, you know, they don't have to sharpen them. But yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know if you had beaver that were only eating pond weeds all day, if you know, at some point that's not a long-term strategy. You gotta chew on rocks somewhere or something to try to get their teeth down.
Thank you. Someone just going by H asks, do you ever remove beaver from the Washington side to the Oregon side? Is it allowable, and how do you accomplish that? We have nuisance beaver in our small lakes, but don't want to lethally remove them. The area is close to Bonneville.
I have never pitched that, but my guess would be there would be no way around the permitting to move a Washington beaver to Oregon. But that said, I bet you can solve whatever the nuisance is that they're creating. I think if you approach it as, you know, can we outsmart the rodent, right? Can the monkeys outsmart the rodent? It's a challenge. I mean, often you can, and I would just see it as a challenge, and see it as a lucky thing that you have those beaver there, right? Because they're going to bring in all the wildlife and everything that's associated with that beaver wetland. Beaver are a pain in the arse, so I definitely am sympathetic to that. But I would also say, given that you've got this, reach out to us at the Beaver Coalition if you've got any questions or you want some further guidance. But yeah, if they're flooding something, usually you can fix that. If they're cutting down trees, you can usually fix that. And then once, the cool thing is, because they retain their territory in the landscape for a long period of time, once you come to that durable long-term solution with the family that you've got, you can really take a step back and relax, because that solution will probably persist for a really long time. You know, you're probably going to have generations of beaver at this site, and they'll all be used to, like, oh, well, we don't know why that dam never, you know, we can never get it to go any higher. There's something weird about it, but they don't keep pushing on it, you know. If you trap them out, then you don't know what next will show up. You know that you have good beaver habitat, so there will be beaver back, and you don't know when, and you don't know what they're going to do. So yeah, just any chance you can to not get up onto that treadmill and start walking, I would encourage it.
Definitely, thank you. Reese asks, how do fish move through beaver dams? Good question.
That is a good question. We have, as humans, blown up a lot of beaver dams because we were helping the fish move upstream. And I think, luckily, at least in Oregon, we've moved past that recently. And we no longer see beaver dams as fish passage barriers. Our own concrete dams are clearly fish passage barriers, but beaver dams act very differently in the landscape. And often during high flow events, beaver aren't out there working on their dam or maintaining their dam. They have plenty of water keeping them safe. And so you'll get parts of the dam calving off. You'll have a lot of flow over the dam for the adult fish. If you go stand by a beaver dam and watch during migration, the adult fish are usually jumping around the sides in the flow. And then juvenile fish move back and forth through beaver dams often. So I remember they're pretty porous, and that's a really great spot to avoid predation too. And so you often have a lot of fish, juvenile fish, in the beaver dam and then moving back and forth. Along that line too, in rivers where you don't have dams, you'll sometimes have these floating collections of beaver sticks, and biologists often call those river reefs because they're often so teeming with fish and with life. They're sort of the bottom productive piece of the food web, and beaver dams act the same way in streams. So we just have to take a step back and say, okay, well, beaver and salmon co-evolved, right? They've clearly worked this relationship out, and rather than looking at beaver dams as a potential passage issue, we need to look at, okay, if we're going to do anything at a beaver dam, if we're going to put in a flow device or a pond leveler, how can we make sure that thing that we do doesn't artificially change those flow pathways in that way that the beaver or the fish are naturally navigating the beaver dam itself. So I think the first paper I read, there was like sort of debunking, you know, oh, beaver dams aren't a problem was from the 30s. And unfortunately, we're still having the conversation. I know some biologists up in Canada who take out beaver dams because it's seen as, well, the fish can't get past. And in the Pacific Northwest, we like to think that sockeye are super wimpy salmon and can't jump. And so there's a lot of focus on removal of beaver dams for sockeye, but I've seen some pretty awesome videos of sockeye moving over beaver dams too. So I guess the last thing I would say on that is, if you've got highly degraded creeks that are super steep and narrow and deep, and then beaver are able to successfully build a dam halfway up, that might be a passage issue for fish at some points, because the fish co-evolved with beaver dams in wide valley bottoms where you didn't have these incised degraded streams that we now have. So I'm definitely sympathetic to the fact that often when you have like the Hoover Dam style beaver dams, where you're in such a trench with the creek that they build quite a structure, that's less of what you would have seen prior to everybody getting trapped out. So it might be a little harder for fish to navigate.
Teresa asks, are you familiar with the history of prehistoric beaver in the area?
No, I've got one of the giant beaver tooths on my desk, which is super cool, but I'm not. I know that there was a lot of species of beaver. Now we're down to Castor canadensis in North America and Castor fibor in Europe, and they more or less act the same way on the landscape. But we had really big beaver and we had really small beaver, and a lot of diversity. And from what we can tell, we don't think the big beaver built dams, but that would be pretty epic if at some point there's some evidence unearthed to suggest that they were logging huge trees and building dams. But yeah, aside from that, I'm not as familiar with sort of the paleontology piece.
I encourage anyone who's interested, when we do reopen our indoor exhibits, to come and check out our new beaver exhibition, because that goes into a little bit of those prehistoric beavers, a few of the different species, right the way from the giant beaver to one that was more the size of a squirrel that was found over in the John Day fossil beds area. So I hope you have an opportunity to check that out, Teresa. Thank you. Jim, and this is probably our final question for the evening. Jim in Bend asks, or says, they used to see quite a few beaver throughout the Deschutes River from upriver here in Bend all the way through to Maupin, starting personally 40 plus years ago. Jim notes he hasn't seen or heard them in quite a while and is asking if you have any population thoughts on the Deschutes corridor. I know there's a few around, but probably less than there were historically.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I would encourage you to reach out to the BeaverWorks Oregon folks, and if you're seeing a drop in beaver population, my first thought is, okay, who locally has a conflict that they haven't been able to resolve, and so they are probably engaging in lethal control. Because that does seem to be. I've worked with a number of landowners now who had historic beaver presence, and then they don't see them anymore. And often what we find is some property sold, half a mile away around the time that that ownership change happened and a different perspective on beaver management happened. Then the landscape started draining into an area. So that would be just my broad. I have no idea if that's applicable, but that would be a kind of hypothesis to hold in the back of your mind and try to falsify. And then if you reach out to Reese and others at BeaverWorks Oregon, I think that would be a good path forward.
Is it quite difficult?
Plant more food too. I mean, if you're in a small stream or in a stream that used to have beaver, you can always do your part to make it enticing to them.
Absolutely. Is it quite difficult to get an accurate population estimate for beavers?
Nobody has one. The state has no idea. None of the biologists working in any of the organizations other than the state have any idea. We don't have a beaver management plan in the state of Oregon. So nobody knows. It's the state animal. but we just don't know. And I don't think it would be too difficult because they're in one very specific area. You know, you're not going to find them roaming the hillsides. They're in a network of streams, and but yeah, it's never been a project.
Okay, and with that, thank you all so much for attending this evening's programme. Jacob, thank you again for sharing your knowledge and your passion for the subject with us this evening. We will send you the links to the Beaver Coalition and local groups working on this issue as well. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Great, thank you.